There is a moment in every long running story where denial finally collapses, where the explanations stop working, and where people are forced to confront the consequences of choices that were once celebrated as progress. This video is about that moment. It is about what happens when one side of society assumes the other side will always show up, always pay the bill, always absorb the cost, and what happens when that assumption quietly dies. Stay with this to the very end because what we are witnessing right now is not a trend, not a phase, but a permanent shift that will define relationships, economics, and daily life going forward. For decades, society ran on an unspoken agreement that men would be the shock absorbers of reality. Men worked longer hours, paid more taxes, absorbed more risk, and stepped in when systems failed. They were expected to provide, to protect, and to smooth over hardship, not because it was written into law, but because it was woven into culture. Over time, that expectation became invisible, taken for granted, and eventually mocked. The assumption was that men would always be there no matter how they were treated, no matter how they were spoken to, no matter how often they were blamed for everything that went wrong. What we are seeing now is what happens when that assumption finally breaks. There's a statistic circulating that says a large majority of women report facing extreme financial stress and insecurity, with many openly stating that they need a man to help them survive. That statement alone would have been unthinkable in mainstream conversation just a decade ago, when independence was celebrated as the ultimate goal and needing anyone was framed as weakness. But reality has a way of cutting through slogans. Inflation does not care about social narratives. Rent does not pause for ideology. Grocery bills do not shrink out of solidarity. When the cost of living rises and support systems quietly vanish, people discover very quickly whether their independence was real or simply subsidized by someone else's effort. At the same time, this financial pressure has been building. Something else has been happening beneath the surface. Large numbers of men have stopped participating. They stopped dating. They stopped approaching. They stopped offering free labor, free attention, free money, and free emotional support. They did not announce it with marches or slogans. They did not demand applause. They simply withdrew. Many men realized that participating in the modern dating and social economy carried high cost and very little return. And instead of arguing about it, they chose absence. And this is what makes the shift so powerful. You cannot shame someone who is no longer in the room. One of the clearest examples of this change shows up in the way dating itself is breaking down. Stories are becoming common of men agreeing to dates only to realize the expectation is not connection, conversation, or mutual interest, but consumption. Expensive meals ordered without hesitation, with no intention of building anything beyond that moment. For a long time, men paid anyway. They paid because it was expected, because they were told that was the price of entry, because refusing would be framed as cheap, bitter, or insecure. But now something has changed. Men are paying their portion and leaving calmly, quietly, without arguing, without trying to convince anyone and of anything. They are simply refusing to play a role they never agreed to perform. This reaction has shocked many people, not because it is cruel, but because it violates a long standing assumption. The assumption was that guilt, embarrassment, or public pressure would always force compliance, that if a man refused to cover the cost, he could be shamed into submission. But shame only works when someone values your approval. Men who have already walked away do not. When someone has accepted solitude, built routines that do not rely on validation, and structured their life around personal peace rather than constant negotiation, shame loses its power. What happens next is uncomfortable, and that discomfort is revealing. When the bill arrives and there is no one willing to cover it, the situation becomes real. Systems designed around the assumption of male participation suddenly have to function without it. Restaurants do not care about dating politics. Landlords do not accept ideological explanations. Financial reality is brutally neutral. When expectations collide with facts, Facts always win. This is why the reaction has been so intense. It is not about a single meal or a single date. It is about the realization that an entire safety net has quietly disappeared. To understand how we got here, you have to look back over several decades of cultural messaging. Men were told repeatedly that they were not needed, that their contributions were replaceable, that their instincts were dangerous, and that their presence was often unwanted. Traditional roles were not merely questioned, but actively ridiculed. Masculinity itself was framed as a problem to be corrected rather than a force to be guided. Boys grew up hearing that they were inherently flawed, that their natural behaviors were suspect, and that they needed constant supervision to avoid causing harm. At the same time, men were still expected to provide the same outcomes. They were expected to pay, to protect, to fix, and to sacrifice, but without acknowledgement or appreciation. The message became contradictory. Men were told to step back, but also to step up, to disappear, but also to deliver, to take responsibility for everything, while being told they were responsible for nothing except harm. Eventually, many men stopped trying to reconcile those contradictions and chose a simpler path. They opted out. What is rarely discussed is how peaceful that decision can be once it is made. Many men discovered that being alone is not the same as being lonely. Without constant emotional turbulence, without the pressure to perform or prove worth, life became quieter. Sleep improved, health improved, focus improved. Men redirected energy into physical fitness, into hobbies, into learning, into work that actually rewarded effort. Some invested their time into technology, markets, and personal development. Others embraced minimalism, reducing expenses and obligations until life felt manageable again. This was not collapse. For many, it felt like relief. Meanwhile, the broader culture continued operating as if men would return at any moment. Dating advice still assumed male pursuit. Financial planning still assumed dual incomes with male contribution. Social safety nets still quietly relied on male labor and taxation. When women now express shock at how difficult survival feels, they are not encountering a new world. They are encountering the old world without the buffer men used to provide. There is an important distinction here that often gets lost. Men did not leave to punish anyone. They did not coordinate. They did not conspire. They responded individually to incentives. When participation felt rewarding, they participated. When participation became costly and unrewarding, they stopped. This is basic human behavior. The idea that men would continue indefinitely out of obligation rather than benefit was always unrealistic. It only lasted as long as social pressure could override personal cost. The reaction to the shift has followed a predictable pattern. First came denial, claims that men would return once they adjusted their attitudes. Then came moralizing, framing withdrawal as selfish or immature. Then came attempts to shame, using language designed to provoke guilt. None of it worked. You cannot argue someone back into a system they have already learned to live without. When men discovered that peace was possible outside the structure they were told was mandatory, the leverage disappeared. What makes this moment different from past social conflicts is the lack of a negotiation table. In previous generations, disputes over roles and expectations were resolved through compromise. Now, there is no compromise being offered that makes participation appealing again. The terms remain one sided, the costs remain high, the risks remain asymmetric. Without meaningful change, absence becomes the rational choice. It is also important to note that this withdrawal is not chaotic. Men are not turning to destruction or disorder. They are not lashing out. They are building quiet, stable lives. They are budgeting carefully. They are prioritizing health. They are choosing environments where effort produces results. This is why the shift is so difficult to counter. There is no visible villain, no dramatic breakdown, no spectacle to rally against. There is only silence and empty seats. The idea that men have always been protected by society is a myth that collapses under even light examination. Men historically faced the most dangerous jobs, the highest expectations, and the least sympathy when they failed. What they did have was purpose. They had a role that made hardship feel meaningful. When that role was stripped away while the hardship remained, the cost benefit equation changed. Men did not become weaker, they became more selective. As economic conditions worsen, this selectivity becomes even more pronounced. When resources are limited, people stop giving them away. Men who once subsidized dating, relationships, and even entire households now look at their budgets and ask simple questions. Does this add value to my life? Does this improve my peace? Does this make tomorrow easier or harder? When the answers are negative, the decision is straightforward. This is why appeals to nostalgia will not work. You cannot simply ask men to return to old roles without restoring old incentives. You cannot demand protection while offering contempt. You cannot expect provision while discouraging partnership. The era where men absorbed losses out of duty alone is ending not because men changed, but because the environment did. What we are witnessing now is the early stage of a long adjustment. Systems that relied on invisible male labor and spending will strain. Social narratives will be rewritten. Some people will adapt. Others will struggle. None of this is about revenge. It is about reality asserting itself after years of denial. There is also a deeper psychological component at play. Many men have learned to trust patterns over promises. They have observed outcomes rather than listening to words. They have noticed that behavior rarely matches rhetoric. Once someone learns that lesson, it is almost impossible to unlearn. Trust shifts from external approval to internal observation. This makes men harder to manipulate and harder to mobilize through emotional appeals. Women expressing fear and desperation are not wrong about the difficulty of the current environment. The cost of living is high, support structures are thin, competition is intense. What is wrong is the assumption that men will automatically step in to fix it. That assumption belongs to a world that no longer exists. As society becomes more unstable, self preservation becomes the dominant strategy. Men who once planned their lives around families and long term obligations now plan around sustainability and peace. They are not rushing into commitments that could collapse under legal, financial, or emotional pressure. They are cautious not because they hate relationships, but because they understand risk. This is why you see so many men focusing on personal mastery rather than partnership. Physical strength, financial literacy, technical skills, and emotional regulation offer reliable returns. They do not depend on someone else's mood or approval. They do not vanish overnight. They build quietly over time. The uncomfortable truth is that many men feel they gave everything they were asked to give, only to be told it was never enough and never appreciated. Walking away was not an act of hostility, it was an act of self respect. Once that line is crossed, it cannot be undone by pressure or panic. We are now entering a phase where consequences replace conversation, where systems adjust not because someone demanded fairness, but because imbalance became unsustainable. This phase is always painful because it exposes assumptions that were never tested against reality. The silence from men is not empty. It is full of routines, choices, and boundaries that were hard won. It represents years of observation and internal debate. It represents a decision to stop negotiating with systems that offered no stable return. What happens next will depend on whether society is willing to acknowledge that withdrawal is feedback. Not rebellion, not hatred, not collapse, but feedback. When a large group exits quietly, it is signaling that participation no longer makes sense. This story is not over. We are only at the beginning. The pressure will increase, the narratives will intensify, but one thing is already clear. Men who have learned to live without approval, without constant demands, and without financial drain, are not eager to return to a structure that failed them. And this brings us to the core question everyone needs to consider. If men are no longer willing to be the invisible foundation holding everything up, what replaces them? That question has no easy answer, and avoiding it will not make it disappear. When people try to explain this shift away as bitterness or resentment, they miss the deeper mechanism at work. What is happening is not emotional collapse, but rational recalibration. Men observed patterns over years, sometimes decades, and adjusted their behavior accordingly. This is how adults respond to environments that no longer reward participation. They do not scream, they do not riot, they simply reallocate their time, energy, and resources. The calmness of this response is what unsettles so many observers because it offers no easy narrative to attack. For a long time, men were told that fulfillment would come through sacrifice. That meaning would be found in constant effort for others. That happiness was something earned by providing stability to people who might never return it. When this promise failed repeatedly, men did not immediately abandon it. They tried harder. They worked more. They paid more. They tolerated more. Only after repeated negative outcomes did they begin to question whether the structure itself was flawed. That questioning phase was quiet and internal. And by the time it reached the surface, the decision had already been made. This is why the current moment feels so abrupt. From the outside, it looks like men vanished overnight. In reality, the withdrawal took years. Each unfair exchange, each dismissed concern, each punished attempt at honesty added weight to the scale. Eventually, the scale tipped. When men finally stepped away, it looked sudden only because no one was paying attention while they were still present. Another factor that cannot be ignored is the way accountability disappeared from many social conversations. Responsibility became optional, consequences negotiable, and outcomes someone else's problem. Men noticed that when things went well, credit flowed freely. But when things went poorly, blame followed them. Over time, this asymmetry eroded trust. Participation without shared responsibility feels like exploitation, not partnership. When men recognized this pattern clearly, withdrawal became the only way to stop the loss. The economic environment accelerated this realization. As costs rose and margins shrank, men could no longer absorb inefficiency without consequences to their own stability. What once felt manageable became unsustainable. Covering expenses that did not serve their long term well being stopped making sense. Financial discipline forced clarity. Budgets do not lie. When the numbers do not add up, ideology does not save you. What many people fail to understand is that men did not replace relationships with emptiness. They replaced them with structure. Schedules replaced chaos. Goals replaced arguments. Progress replaced negotiation. This shift brought a level of control that many men had never experienced before. Without constant external demands, they could plan, execute, and rest. That sense of agency is powerful, and once experienced, it is difficult to surrender. There is also a generational component here that deserves attention. Younger men grew up watching older men struggle under systems that offered little reward and heavy penalties. They saw marriages dissolve, finances drained, reputations damaged, and mental health decline. They learned from observation, not theory. When the opportunity to opt out appeared, many took it without hesitation. This was not rebellion, it was adaptation. Meanwhile, cultural messaging continued to lag behind reality. Advice aimed at men often assumed guilt as a starting point. Improvement was framed as compliance rather than growth. Accountability was demanded without reciprocity. Over time, men stopped engaging with these messages altogether. When advice does not acknowledge lived experience, it loses relevance. Silence replaces dialogue. The reaction to male withdrawal often includes appeals to morality. Arguments that men owe participation to society, to women, or to tradition. But obligation without benefit eventually collapses. Moral arguments only hold power when they align with mutual interest. When morality becomes a one way street, It feels less like ethics and more like coercion. Men recognized this distinction and responded accordingly. There is also an uncomfortable truth that many men discovered through solitude. They learned that peace does not require constant companionship. That fulfillment can come from mastery, from routine, from small personal victories that do not depend on anyone else's approval. This realization undermines a long held belief that men need relationships to be complete. When that belief falls apart, so does the leverage built upon it. As this shift continues, social structures that relied on male initiative are beginning to show cracks. Dating markets slow, social events thin out, support networks weaken, not because men are hostile, but because they are absent. Absence is harder to confront than opposition. You cannot argue with someone who is not there. You cannot negotiate with someone who has already built a life that does not include you. Some have attempted to frame this as a temporary correction, suggesting that men will return once conditions stabilize. This misunderstands the permanence of learned behavior. Once someone has discovered that they can thrive outside a system, returning requires a compelling reason. Stability alone is not enough. The system must offer something better than what they already have. So far, that offer has not materialized. The emotional tone of many public discussions reveals fear more than anger. Fear that the safety net is gone. Fear that assumptions no longer hold. Fear that the future will require adaptation rather than entitlement. These fears are understandable, but fear does not create solutions. Only honest assessment does. Men walking away are not celebrating hardship for anyone else. They are simply prioritizing their own survival and peace. In uncertain times, this is a rational strategy. When institutions weaken, individuals strengthen themselves. This pattern repeats throughout history. What is different now is how openly it is happening. Another layer to this issue is the collapse of trust. Trust is built through consistency between words and actions. Many men noticed that promises were rarely kept, while expectations were strictly enforced. This imbalance taught men to rely on what they could control rather than what they were told. Trust shifted inward. Once that happens, external persuasion loses effectiveness. The narrative that men are abandoning responsibility ignores the fact that many are taking responsibility for themselves for the first time. They are managing finances carefully. They are maintaining physical health. They are setting boundaries. They are saying no to arrangements that do not serve them. This is not irresponsibility, it is self governance. And as more men adopt this mindset, the cultural center of gravity shifts. Norms change not through declarations, but through repetition. When enough people behave differently, the old rules stop working. We are watching that process unfold in real time. There's also a quiet dignity in this withdrawal that rarely gets acknowledged. Men are not demanding recognition for their absence. They are not asking for apologies. They are not threatening consequences. They are simply living. This understated response contrasts sharply with the intensity of the reaction it provokes. Some argue that this trend will lead to widespread isolation and unhappiness. Yet many men report the opposite: reduced stress, clearer goals, better sleep, improved health. These outcomes challenge assumptions about what happiness requires. When evidence contradicts belief, belief often resists rather than adapts. It is also worth noting that men who walk away are not necessarily opposed to connection. They are opposed to imbalance. They are open to relationships that offer mutual respect, shared responsibility, and clear boundaries. What they reject are arrangements where effort flows in one direction and accountability in another. As economic pressure increases, these standards will only tighten. Scarcity forces efficiency. Inefficient relationships become liabilities rather than luxuries. Men understand this intuitively, even if it is rarely articulated. The idea that men owe society endless participation ignores the fact that society often failed to protect them in return. Legal systems, social narratives, and cultural norms frequently punish men for outcomes beyond their control. When protection becomes punishment, withdrawal becomes self defense. What makes this moment especially challenging is that it cannot be resolved through messaging alone. No slogan will reverse it. No campaign will shame men back into compliance. Only structural change can alter incentives. That requires honest acknowledgement of imbalance, not denial. As the conversation continues, there will be attempts to rewrite history, to minimize male contribution, or to frame withdrawal as a moral failing. These attempts will fail because they do not address the core issue. People do not stay where they are consistently harmed, they leave. Men who have built stable, quiet lives are not eager to gamble that stability on promises they have already seen broken. Trust, once lost, is difficult to rebuild. It requires consistent action over time, not words under pressure. This is why the adjustment ahead will be slow and uneven. Some will adapt quickly, rethinking expectations and responsibilities. Others will cling to old assumptions until reality forces change. The longer the delay, the more painful the transition. What is clear is that the era of automatic male participation is over. Any future involvement will be conditional, selective, and deliberate. Men will choose based on outcomes, not obligations. This represents a fundamental shift in how relationships and society function. As we move forward, the question is not whether men will return to old roles, but whether new roles will emerge that make sense for everyone involved. That process will require humility, honesty, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. One of the most misunderstood aspects of this shift is the assumption that it emerged from hostility rather than exhaustion. Hostility is loud, exhaustion is quiet. Hostility seeks confrontation, exhaustion seeks distance. Men did not reach this point because they wanted conflict. They reached it because conflict became constant and resolution disappeared. When every interaction feels like a negotiation where the terms are already decided, walking away stops feeling dramatic and starts feeling logical. For many men, the realization came gradually through lived experience rather than ideology. They noticed that effort did not produce appreciation, that boundaries were interpreted as selfishness, and that silence was often safer than honesty. They learned that speaking openly could be used against them later, reframed, or exaggerated in ways they could not control. Over time, self protection replaced self expression. When people stop feeling safe telling the truth, they stop participating altogether. This dynamic has profound consequences for trust. Trust cannot survive in environments where intent is constantly questioned and outcomes are predetermined. Men learn to observe rather than explain, to document rather than defend, and eventually to disengage rather than endure. These habits did not develop overnight. They were built through repetition. Each negative experience reinforced the lesson until it became instinct. Another element that accelerated the shift is the way modern life fragments responsibility. When things go wrong, accountability is diffused. Systems fail, but no one is responsible. Relationships fail, but fault is assigned selectively. Men noticed that responsibility was expected of them, while accountability for others was optional. This imbalance created resentment, not because responsibility is unfair, but because it was not shared. As men stepped back, they began to see their own lives more clearly. Without constant external pressure, priorities reordered themselves. Health rose to the top. Time became valuable rather than something to fill with obligation. Money stopped being a tool for approval and became a resource to manage carefully. These changes produced tangible improvements, lower stress, better focus, greater stability. Once those benefits appeared, returning to chaos felt unnecessary. There is also a psychological freedom that comes from accepting limits. Men stopped trying to fix everything. They stopped believing it was their role to absorb every failure and smooth over every conflict. This acceptance reduced anxiety. It clarified responsibility. It allowed men to focus on what they could actually influence rather than what they were expected to carry. Public conversations often frame this withdrawal as antisocial behavior. But that framing ignores the reality that many men are still highly social. They simply choose contexts where interaction is straightforward and expectations are clear. Friendships based on shared interests, communities built around skills or goals, environments where respect is mutual rather than demanded. These spaces exist, and men gravitate toward them naturally. What is fading is not male sociability, but male tolerance for imbalance. This distinction matters. Men did not reject connection, they rejected exploitation. When connection feels transactional without transparency, trust erodes. When generosity is met with entitlement, generosity dries up. The economic implications of this shift are significant. Consumer behavior changes when large groups withdraw discretionary spending. Industries built around dating, lifestyle consumption, and social signaling feel the impact first. Less spending on performative experiences, more spending on personal tools, education, and health. This redistribution of resources reflects changing priorities. There's also a subtle but important change in how men view time. Time is no longer something to give away casually. It is treated as finite and valuable. This awareness sharpens decision making. Men ask whether an activity adds meaning or drains it. If the answer is negative, they decline without explanation. This boundary setting is often misinterpreted as coldness, but it is simply clarity. As more men adopt this approach, social pressure loses effectiveness. You cannot pressure someone who has already accepted exclusion. When rejection no longer hurts, manipulation fails. This is why many traditional tactics feel ineffective now. The audience they were designed to influence has already moved on. There is also an intergenerational feedback loop forming. Younger men observe older men who chose withdrawal and see the results: stability, peace, autonomy. These outcomes stand in contrast to warnings that solitude leads to despair. Evidence matters more than rhetoric. When lived examples contradict messaging, messaging loses authority. Another uncomfortable reality is that many men feel they were never allowed to define success on their own terms. Success was framed as compliance with external expectations rather than internal satisfaction. Walking away allowed men to redefine what winning looks like: not status, not approval, not validation, but calm, health, and control. This redefinition challenges deeply ingrained narratives about masculinity and purpose. If men no longer measure worth through sacrifice alone, then systems built on that sacrifice must adapt or fail. Resistance to this idea is strong because it threatens established power dynamics. But resistance does not stop change, it only delays adaptation. The emotional tone of many responses reveals anxiety about losing leverage. When men no longer chase approval, approval loses value as a bargaining chip. When men stop fearing exclusion, exclusion stops working as a threat. This forces a recalibration of social dynamics that many are unprepared for. Some attempt to argue that men owe participation because they benefit from society. This argument ignores the fact that benefits are conditional and uneven. Men contribute heavily to systems that often return little protection. When contribution exceeds return consistently, withdrawal becomes a rational response. This is not unique to gender dynamics. It is a basic principle of human behavior. As this recalibration continues, we see more men investing in self sufficiency, learning skills that reduce dependence, simplifying lifestyles, choosing environments with lower costs and fewer obligations. These choices increase resilience. In uncertain times, resilience matters more than approval. The idea that the shift represents a collapse of values misunderstands what values are. Values are not slogans, they are behaviors sustained over time. Men are demonstrating values of responsibility to self, discipline, and hence honesty about limits. These values may not align with traditional expectations, but they are not absence of values. They are different values. There is also a quiet grief beneath this transformation that rarely gets acknowledged. Many men did not want to walk away. They wanted cooperation, respect, and partnership. When those proved unavailable, they adjusted. Grief does not always look like sadness. Sometimes it looks like acceptance. Acceptance can be mistaken for indifference, but it is not the same. As men accepted this new reality, they stopped arguing for change and started living as if change would not come. This is perhaps the most important shift. When people stop lobbying and start adapting, the window for negotiation closes. The system must then respond to behavior rather than complaints. And the longer this pattern continues, the harder it becomes to reverse. Habits solidify. New routines replace old ones. Networks form around shared understanding rather than conflict. These networks do not depend on external validation. They are self-sustaining. There is also a reduction in emotional volatility that comes with withdrawal. Fewer arguments, fewer misunderstandings, fewer high-stakes conflicts. Calm becomes the default. For many men, this calm is addictive in the best sense. Once experienced, it becomes a standard. Critics often predict long-term dissatisfaction, but they underestimate the adaptability of human beings. People adjust their expectations to match reality. Men who no longer expect certain outcomes do not mourn their absence endlessly. They build new sources of meaning. And this does not mean that relationships are obsolete. It means that they must compete with peace. Any arrangement that introduces more stress than value will lose to solitude. This is the new baseline. It is not ideological, it is experiential. As society grapples with this shift, there will be attempts to pathologize male withdrawal, to label it as avoidance or immaturity. These labels serve to dismiss rather than understand. Understanding would require acknowledging imbalance. Dismissal avoids that discomfort. What is striking is how little effort men put into defending their choice publicly. They do not write manifestos, they do not demand recognition, they simply continue living differently. This quiet persistence is more effective than any argument. And over time, the absence becomes normalized. New generations grow up seeing fewer traditional pairings, fewer automatic assumptions, fewer scripts being followed. This changes expectations organically. What once felt radical becomes ordinary. The conversation ahead will be challenging because it forces a confrontation with reality rather than intention. Intentions do not pay bills, intentions do not repair trust, outcomes do. Men have judged outcomes and adjusted accordingly. As pressure builds, some will attempt to rush reconciliation without addressing root causes. These attempts will fail because they treat symptoms rather than structure. Sustainable change requires fairness, reciprocity, and respect. Without these, withdrawal remains rational. The question society faces is not how to force men back into participation, but how to make participation worth choosing. That question demands humility. It demands listening rather than lecturing. It demands change rather than insistence. As this shift continues to unfold, one of the most revealing reactions has been the insistence that men must be persuaded, convinced, or reminded of their supposed duties. This framing misunderstands what has changed. Persuasion only works when the listener believes the speaker has credibility. Many men no longer grant that credibility to institutions or voices that dismiss their experiences for years. When trust erodes, arguments become noise. What remains is behavior, and behavior tells the truth more clearly than words ever could. Men learned this lesson through repetition. They watched promises dissolve under pressure. They saw standards applied selectively. They experienced consequences that were permanent while assurances were temporary. Over time, they stopped listening to what people said and started measuring what actually happened. This pattern recognition is not emotional, it is analytical. Once learned, it reshapes decision making permanently. Another dimension of this change is the rejection of constant evaluation. Many men grew tired of feeling like they were always being measured, judged, or assessed against shifting criteria. No matter what they did, it was never quite enough, never quite correct, never quite aligned with the latest expectation. Living under perpetual scrutiny drains motivation. Walking away restores autonomy. Autonomy restores energy. When men removed themselves from environments where they felt perpetually on trial, they discovered how much mental space had been consumed by anticipation and defense. Without that background noise, thinking became clearer, decisions became simpler, emotional regulation improved. These benefits reinforced the choice to remain disengaged. The reward was immediate and tangible. It is also important to recognize that many men did not just walk away from dating or relationships, but from the entire performance culture surrounding them. The need to impress, to signal status, to meet arbitrary benchmarks lost its appeal. Men simplified. They bought less. They needed less. They stopped trying to prove anything to people who did not value proof anyway. This simplification had cascading effects. Lower expenses reduced financial stress. Reduced stress improved health. Improved health increased confidence. Confidence reduced the need for external validation. This cycle is self reinforcing. Once it begins, it becomes difficult to interrupt. Public discourse often treats this development as a crisis, but from the perspective of the men experiencing it, it often feels like resolution. Problems that seemed unsolvable disappeared once the framework creating them was removed. This does not mean life became effortless. It means effort became purposeful rather than compulsory. There is also a structural reason this shift is accelerating. Modern systems increasingly reward specialization and individual competence. Men who focus on skills, knowledge, and discipline find tangible returns. These returns do not depend on social approval. They compound quietly over time. When compared to the volatility of relational investment, the contrast is stark. As men invest more heavily in themselves, the opportunity cost of distraction rises. Time spent managing conflict or navigating unclear expectations feels increasingly expensive. Men begin to guard their attention with the same care they guard their finances. Attention becomes a currency, and like any currency, it is allocated where returns are highest. This reframing of attention changes social dynamics profoundly. People accustomed to immediate access find themselves waiting. Expectations built on instant responsiveness no longer hold. Men who control their attention control their environment. This shift redistributes power quietly but decisively. Another underappreciated aspect of this transformation is the decline of rescue behavior. Men were often conditioned to step in, fix problems, and absorb consequences. Over time, this behavior became expected rather than appreciated. When men stopped rescuing, the absence was immediately felt. Problems that had been deferred surfaced. This exposure created discomfort, but discomfort is not injustice. It is simply reality no longer being filtered. The discomfort many feel now stems from encountering consequences directly rather than through a buffer. Men had long served as that buffer. Their withdrawal reveals how much labor went unnoticed. When that labor disappears, its value becomes obvious. This realization challenges long standing narratives about independence. True independence means bearing consequences, not outsourcing them. When systems relied on male intervention while denying its importance, they created a contradiction that could not last. Contradictions eventually collapse. Men who have accepted this reality do not feel obligated to explain it repeatedly. Explanation was attempted, dialogue was offered. When it failed, behavior replaced argument. This transition marks a psychological boundary. Once crossed, it rarely reverses. There is also a moral clarity that emerges when men stop participating in arrangements that conflict with their values. They no longer feel complicit in dynamics they consider unfair. This alignment between belief and action reduces internal conflict. Reduced internal conflict increases stability. Critics sometimes argue that this withdrawal undermines community, but community without reciprocity is not community. It is extraction. Healthy communities require shared responsibility and mutual respect. Men did not reject community, they rejected asymmetry. As these patterns become more widespread, institutions face pressure to adapt. Policies built on assumptions of male participation must adjust to new realities. This adaptation will be slow and contested because it challenges entrenched interests. But demographic and behavioral shifts are difficult to ignore indefinitely. One of the most striking features of this moment is how little coordination it required. There was no central movement, no unified message, no organizing body. Individual decisions aggregated into collective impact. This is often how meaningful change occurs quietly, incrementally, inevitably. Men often describe this phase of life as lighter, not because responsibilities vanish, but because chosen responsibilities replace imposed ones. Choice restores dignity. Dignity restores motivation. Motivation fuels progress. And this does not mean men are indifferent to the struggles of others. It means they no longer feel obligated to sacrifice themselves for systems that do not reciprocate. Compassion without boundaries leads to burnout. Boundaries preserve compassion. As conversations continue, there will be pressure to reframe male withdrawal as a temporary protest. This framing minimizes the depth of the change. Protests aim to force response. Withdrawal accepts non response and moves on. The difference matters. Men who have restructured their lives around independence are not waiting for permission to re engage. They are evaluating whether engagement aligns with their goals. This evaluation is ongoing and dynamic. It does not respond to urgency or fear based appeals. Another subtle shift is the decline of romantic idealism. Many men replaced idealized expectations with realistic assessments. They stopped projecting meaning onto uncertain arrangements. This realism reduces disappointment. It also reduces vulnerability to manipulation. Realism is often mistaken for cynicism, but the two are different. Cynicism assumes bad intent. Realism observes patterns and adjusts accordingly. Men who walk away are not assuming the worst. They are acting on what they have consistently observed. As realism spreads, conversations about relationships become more grounded. Fantasies lose influence. Practical considerations gain importance. This shift is uncomfortable for narratives built on emotion alone, but it aligns more closely with lived experience. There is also a reduction in drama that accompanies withdrawal. Without constant engagement, conflicts lose fuel. Issues that once escalated fade without attention. Silence, in this context, is not neglect, it is de escalation. Men who value peace increasingly design their lives to protect it. They choose environments with fewer triggers, fewer demands, fewer uncertainties. This intentional design contrasts with earlier phases of life driven by external validation. Over time, this design philosophy extends beyond personal life into professional and social spheres. Men seek work that offers autonomy. They choose collaborations with clear expectations. They avoid arrangements with ambiguous roles. Clarity becomes a priority. As clarity increases, satisfaction often follows. Satisfaction does not require excitement, it requires alignment. Alignment between effort and reward, alignment between values and actions. Men are finding that alignment outside traditional scripts. The reaction to this alignment reveals how dependent many systems were on unexamined assumptions. When those assumptions fail, blame often replaces introspection. Blame is easier than change, but blame does not restore participation. Men are not immune to hardship, they are simply choosing hardship they can manage over hardship imposed without consent. This distinction is crucial. Choice transforms burden into challenge. Lack of choice transforms burden into resentment. As the broader culture grapples with these realities, it faces a decision. It can acknowledge imbalance and adapt, or it can deny and escalate pressure. Escalation may produce short term compliance, but it accelerates long term withdrawal. Adaptation offers a chance at renewal. The path forward requires recognizing that participation is voluntary, not guaranteed. It must be earned through fairness and respect. This applies not just to gender dynamics, but to all social structures. Men walking away are not closing doors forever. They are simply no longer standing in doorways waiting to be pushed through. They have stepped aside to build something else. The absence they create is not empty, it is filled with routines, skills, friendships, and quiet achievements. It is a different kind of life, one that does not seek applause. As this life becomes more visible, it challenges narratives that equate worth with sacrifice alone. It suggests that self respect and contribution need not be opposites. They can coexist, but only under conditions of reciprocity. The future will likely see a redefinition of partnership, community, and responsibility. These concepts will need to evolve to remain relevant. Clinging to outdated models will only deepen disconnect. Men have already adapted. The question is whether the rest of society is willing to do the same. As these patterns solidify, one of the most striking developments is how little external validation matters to men who have fully adjusted to this new posture. In earlier stages, many men still sought acknowledgement that they were making the right choice, still felt the pull of explanation, still wondered whether disengagement was temporary. Over time, that uncertainty fades. When daily life becomes calmer, when finances stabilize, when emotional strain decreases, the results speak louder than any reassurance ever could. Validation is replaced by evidence, and evidence is persuasive. This transition marks a psychological threshold. On one side of that threshold is negotiation, justification, and hope that conditions will improve if enough effort is applied. On the other side is acceptance that conditions are structural, not accidental. Once men cross that threshold, their behavior becomes remarkably consistent. They stop oscillating between engagement and withdrawal. They simply remain disengaged unless something fundamentally different presents itself. One reason this change feels so destabilizing to observers is that it removes predictability. For decades, social systems relied on men responding in expected ways, even when those responses were costly to them. Men were predictable because they were conditioned to prioritize duty over outcome. When outcome replaces duty as the primary decision metric, predictability disappears. Each choice becomes contextual, conditional, and individual. This unpredictability is often mislabeled as irresponsibility, but it is the opposite. It reflects heightened awareness of consequences. Men are no longer willing to commit to paths with unclear or unfavorable risk profiles. They approach life with the same caution they would apply to any serious investment. They assess downside, volatility, and potential return. When risk outweighs reward, they decline. As this mindset spreads, It alters the emotional economy of relationships. Emotional labor, once expected as a default contribution from men, becomes optional and selectively offered. Men conserve emotional energy for environments where it is respected. This conservation is not cruelty, it is sustainability. Burnout taught many men that limitless availability leads to depletion, not connection. Another important shift is the way men relate to conflict. Previously, conflict was often endured or absorbed in the name of harmony. Now, conflict is evaluated. Men ask whether resolution is possible, whether effort will be reciprocated, and whether engagement will improve outcomes. If the answer is no, they disengage early rather than escalating. This reduces drama, but also reduces tolerance for dysfunctional dynamics. The broader cultural discomfort with this change stems from the loss of leverage. When men were willing to tolerate discomfort indefinitely, pressure tactics worked, guilt worked, accusation worked. Now those tactics fall flat. Men who have already accepted being misunderstood are not motivated by fear of mischaracterization. They no longer expend energy correcting narratives that do not affect their lives. This is why many attempts to reignite participation feel hollow. They appeal to emotions men have already processed and moved beyond. They reference duties men no longer recognize as legitimate. They assume a dependency that no longer exists. The message misses the audience because the audience has changed. Men have also become more selective about information itself. Many disengage not only from relationships, but from media cycles, online arguments, and constant outrage. They recognized that emotional stimulation was being used as a control mechanism. By stepping away, they regained mental clarity. Reduced exposure led to improved focus and mood. This reinforced the decision to remain detached. There is a noticeable shift toward long term thinking. Men plan further ahead, but with fewer assumptions. They build redundancy into their lives. They save more. They avoid unnecessary debt. They choose stability over excitement. These choices are often portrayed as dull or unambitious, but they reflect a mature understanding of risk in an unstable environment. The idea that this shift represents fear of commitment misunderstands the nature of commitment itself. Commitment without security is not virtue, it is liability. Men are not afraid of commitment. They are unwilling to commit to structures that penalize them for doing so. This distinction is rarely acknowledged, but it is central to understanding the change. As more men internalize this logic, social pressure loses its bite. Pressure relies on shared assumptions. When assumptions dissolve, pressure has nowhere to land. Men no longer accept the premise that disengagement is a failure. For many, it feels like progress. This reframing alters identity. Men stop defining themselves through external roles and begin defining themselves through internal standards. Discipline replaces approval. Consistency replaces praise. These metrics are quieter but more reliable. They cannot be taken away by public opinion. There is also a shift in how men relate to uncertainty. Previously, uncertainty was something to be mitigated through partnership or collective effort. Now, uncertainty is treated as a constant. Men focus on adaptability rather than control. They build lives that can withstand disruption rather than assuming stability will be provided externally. This adaptability extends to geography, work, and lifestyle. Men choose flexible arrangements, they avoid entanglements that limit mobility, they value optionality. Optionality becomes a form of security. The ability to change course without catastrophic loss is prioritized over rigid plans. As these values take hold, traditional milestones lose their centrality. Success is no longer measured by conformity to a timeline, but by quality of life. Men question whether milestones serve them or merely signal compliance. If the latter, they opt out. The reaction to this opt out often includes moral framing, suggesting that men are abandoning social responsibility. But responsibility begins with self-governance. Men who cannot sustain themselves cannot meaningfully contribute to others. By prioritizing stability, men are not rejecting responsibility. They are redefining it. This redefinition has ripple effects. When men stop absorbing excess demand, systems are forced to confront inefficiencies. What once appeared functional only worked because someone else was compensating for its flaws. Withdrawal exposes those flaws. Exposure creates pressure for reform. Reform, however, is uncomfortable. It requires admitting dependence. It requires acknowledging imbalance. These admissions are resisted because they challenge narratives of self-sufficiency and progress, but denial does not restore functionality. Adaptation does. Men who have stepped away are not waiting for apologies, they are waiting for evidence. Evidence that roles have changed. Evidence that expectations are reciprocal. Evidence that participation will not result in predictable loss. Without that evidence, disengagement remains the rational choice. Another subtle but important effect of the shift is the normalization of solitude. Solitude is no longer framed solely as absence or failure. It is reframed as a valid state. Men learn to enjoy their own company. They cultivate inner lives. This reduces desperation and increases discernment. Discernment changes everything. Men with discernment are harder to manipulate, harder to rush, harder to intimidate. They move at their own pace. They decide deliberately. This frustrates systems built on urgency and emotional leverage. As discernment spreads, the cultural tempo slows. Fewer impulsive commitments, fewer rushed decisions, more caution. This slowdown is often criticized as stagnation, but it may represent a necessary recalibration after decades of unsustainable acceleration. There is also an increase in peer-based respect among men. Without competition for external validation, interactions become more straightforward. Men support each other's goals without comparison. This solidarity is quiet but durable. Critics often misinterpret this solidarity as exclusionary, but it is simply selective. Men choose environments where respect is implicit. They avoid spaces where it must be negotiated. This selectivity preserves energy. As time passes, the absence of men in certain spaces becomes normalized. What was once shocking becomes expected. New norms form around this absence. Systems adjust or shrink accordingly. This is not collapse, it is reconfiguration. The long-term implications of this reconfiguration are significant. Family structures change. Consumption patterns shift. Social rituals evolve. None of this happens overnight, but the trajectory is clear. Assumptions built on automatic male participation are no longer reliable. What remains to be seen is how society responds. Will it adapt by creating conditions that make participation appealing again? Or will it double down on pressure and moralizing? History suggests that adaptation yields better outcomes, but adaptation requires humility. Men have already demonstrated their willingness to adapt. They changed their behavior in response to incentives. They did not demand the world change for them. They changed themselves. This adaptability is a strength that often goes unrecognized. As this discussion continues, it is important to resist simplistic explanations. This shift is not about bitterness, hatred, or collapse. It is about alignment, alignment between effort and reward, alignment between values and action, alignment between reality and expectation. When alignment is absent, withdrawal follows. When alignment is restored, participation becomes possible again. This principle applies universally. It is not gender specific, it is human. Men walking away are not an anomaly, they are a signal that something fundamental has changed. Ignoring that signal will not make it disappear. Engaging with it honestly offers the only path forward. As this long transition reaches its current stage, The most important thing to understand is that what looks like absence is actually presence redirected. Men did not vanish into nothingness. They redirected their attention inward toward systems and routines that respond predictably to effort. This redirection is the defining characteristic of the moment we are living through. It explains why so many attempts to re engage men fall flat. The appeal is being made to a version of men that no longer exists. The men who once responded to obligation, guilt, or expectation have been replaced by men who respond to outcomes. The outcomes have become the central language. If an arrangement produces stability, calm, and growth, it remains under consideration. If it produces stress, confusion, or loss without compensation, it is quietly discarded. This framework is not emotional, it is operational. It reflects a mindset shaped by repeated exposure to systems that demanded sacrifice without accountability. Men adapted by becoming selective rather than reactive. One of the most misunderstood consequences of this adaptation is how it reshapes empathy. Men did not lose empathy, they learned to apply it with boundaries. Unlimited empathy without structure leads to exploitation and burnout. Structured empathy preserves both compassion and self respect. Men who once overextended learned this lesson through experience. They now offer support where it is reciprocated and withdraw where it is not. This is not coldness, it is discernment. As discernment becomes more common, social interactions become more honest. There is less pretending, less posturing, less performance. Men are less interested in saying the right thing and more interested in living well. This shift reduces noise. It strips away superficial engagement and leaves only what can stand on its own. Many relationships and expectations cannot. That loss is painful, but it is also clarifying. Clarification is uncomfortable because it removes plausible deniability. When men withdraw, they are not making accusations. They are making choices. Those choices force others to confront the reality that participation was never guaranteed. It was conditional on fairness, respect, and mutual benefit. When those conditions eroded, so did participation. This moment exposes how much of modern life depended on unspoken assumptions. Assumptions about who would pay, who would absorb risk, who would step in when things became difficult. These assumptions worked only as long as they were invisible. Once questioned, they could not survive scrutiny. Men questioned them quietly and acted accordingly. There is a temptation to frame this as a temporary correction, a pendulum that will swing back once pressures ease. That interpretation ignores how deeply habits have changed. Men who have built lives around autonomy do not easily surrender it. Autonomy becomes a baseline expectation. Any future engagement must respect it or fail. This does not mean cooperation is impossible. It means cooperation must be grounded in reality rather than nostalgia. The past cannot be recreated because the conditions that sustained it no longer exist. Any future model must acknowledge changed incentives, changed risks, and changed expectations. One of the clearest signs that this shift is durable is how calmly it is being lived. Men are not counting days. They are not waiting for permission. They are not threatening to return or leave. They are simply continuing. This continuity is what transforms a trend into a structural change. The cultural response often oscillates between alarm and dismissal. Alarm when the consequences become visible, dismissal when responsibility feels uncomfortable. Neither response addresses the root cause. The root cause is misalignment. When effort and reward drift too far apart, participation declines. This is not a moral failure, it is a systemic signal. Signals can be ignored for a time, but they do not stop transmitting. As more men operate from this framework, its effects compound. Fewer automatic contributions, fewer assumed rescues, more direct exposure to reality. Systems that relied on buffering must adapt or contract. Adaptation requires honesty. It requires acknowledging that men's withdrawal is not irrational or malicious. It is responsive. It is shaped by incentives and experiences. Condemning it without understanding it guarantees further disengagement. Understanding does not require agreement. It requires listening without pre-deciding conclusions. It requires recognizing that people respond to how they are treated more than to how they are instructed. Men responded to years of messaging, policy, and practice by adjusting their behavior. That adjustment is the outcome of the experiment, whether anyone likes it or not. The longer this adjustment continues, the more it will influence future generations. Young men are learning from observation, not lectures. They see what brings peace and what brings chaos. They choose accordingly. This learning is quiet but powerful. Young women are also observing. Some will adapt quickly, recognizing that old scripts no longer function. Others will resist, hoping the past can be restored through pressure or moral argument. Time will clarify which approach is viable. What must be avoided is the temptation to escalate conflict. Escalation hardens positions and deepens withdrawal. Cooperation, if it is to return, must be invited through fairness, not demanded through shame. Men walking away are not declaring war. They are declaring boundaries. Boundaries are not an attack. They are a condition for sustainable interaction. Without them, relationships collapse under the weight of unmet expectations. This period will be remembered as a turning point, not because of dramatic events, but because of quiet decisions repeated millions of times. Decisions to stop explaining. Decisions to stop absorbing cost silently. Decisions to live within limits rather than pretending limits do not exist. These decisions reshape daily life in subtle ways. Fewer rushed commitments, more intentional routines, less tolerance for chaos, more appreciation for simplicity. These are not signs of withdrawal from life. They are signs of engagement on different terms. The idea that men are abandoning society misunderstands the nature of society itself. Society is not a fixed structure. It is a collection of behaviors. When behaviors change, society changes. Men are not outside society. They are reshaping it through absence from certain roles and presence in others. And this reshaping will continue regardless of commentary. It does not require permission. It does not pause for debate. It unfolds through lived choices. The only question is whether institutions and relationships evolve in response or remain anchored to assumptions that no longer hold. There is still space for cooperation, partnership, and shared purpose. But those concepts must be rebuilt on reciprocity rather than expectation. They must be earned rather than assumed. They must respect autonomy rather than suppress it. Men have shown that they are capable of adaptation. They adapted when conditions worsened. They adapted when incentives changed. They adapted when participation became costly. This adaptability is not going away. Any future engagement must work with it rather than against it. As the dust settles, what remains is clarity. Clarity about limits, clarity about value, clarity about what people are willing to give and what they are not. This clarity may feel harsh, but it is also honest. Honesty is the foundation of anything sustainable. Without it, systems limp along until they break. With it, they can be rebuilt in forms that make sense for the people living within them. This is not the end of connection. It is the end of automatic obligation. It is the end of silent sacrifice without acknowledgement. It is the end of pretending that outcomes do not matter. The future will belong to arrangements that respect reality. reality of economics, reality of human psychology, reality of incentives. Anything that ignores these realities will struggle to survive. Men walking away did not create these realities. They responded to them. Their response is information. What is done with that information will shape what comes next. Before we close, I want to hear from you. What did you think about what was discussed in this video? Do you agree with the direction things are moving? Are you seeing similar patterns in your own life or among people you know? Leave a comment and share your thoughts, because these conversations matter and they help bring clarity to issues that are often ignored or misunderstood. And like the video, if you like it, don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.